Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is John Quigley. I'm the Assistant Dean for Advancement in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I want to welcome you to our Alumni Academy presentation. Before we start, I want to ask everyone to please mute your microphones and keep them muted. This will ensure that everybody can hear our presenters. I also want to let you know that we'll be recording this presentation, and we plan to make it available via the college's YouTube page. Lastly, I want to ask you to hold your questions until the professors are done with their presentations. At that time, we will open things up for discussion and Q&A. Right now, I want to turn things over to Jeff Bastable, who will be introducing our presenters. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks, John, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us today. My name's Jeff Bastable. I graduated from Syracuse University in 1969 with a degree in geography, and also earned a master's in chemistry in 1973. My wife, Susan, also graduated from SU. We live outside of Syracuse in Fayetteville. I've had several leadership positions in the healthcare industry over many years, and now I work primarily as a consultant and also serve as a founding board member of Honor Flight Syracuse, a nonprofit. I'm also a member of the College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Advisory Board, and have also served as a board member for many years, and am a past president of the Syracuse University Varsity Club. As many of you know, the College of Arts and Sciences is the largest and oldest college at SU, and it is the home of the liberal arts at SU. Every student at SU takes classes in arts and sciences, so teaching is a huge part of its mission. Arts and Sciences is also the driver of the university's research mission, as you will see today, and our humanities faculty are world-class thinkers and researchers who are also committed to both undergraduate teaching and research. Right now, I would like to introduce our presenters. Professor Samuel Gorvitz, a former dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and a professor in the Department of Philosophy, is a leader in the development of the field of medical ethics. He's also a friend of my wife and me. Since 1988, he has served by gubernatorial appointment on the New York State Task Force of Life and the Law. Professor Gorovitz was Deering Daly Professor of Bioethics and Humanities at the SUNY Upstate Medical Center here in Syracuse from 2001 to 2004. And for 2004 to 2005 was a visiting professor of philosophy and bioethicist in residence at Yale University. In 2007, he was appointed by New York's governor to the new Empire State Stem Cell Board, which oversees a $600 million commitment to stem cell research in New York State. Professor Gorvitz is also founding director of the Renee Crown University Honors Program, a crown jewel of the university. Professor Gorvitz received a Bachelor of Science from MIT in 1960 and his PhD from Stanford in 1963. Professor Gorovitz is joined by Associate Professor Hille Paakkunainen, also from the Department of Philosophy. Her research focuses on the foundations of ethics and of justified belief. She regularly teaches courses in ethics and epistemology, and her ethics courses often include a bioethics component. She is also the inaugural director of Syracuse University's new Health Humanities major. This is an interdisciplinary major that enables students to gain ethically, culturally, historically, and socially informed critical perspectives on health, illness, disability, and healing. Professor Paakkunainen received her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh and joined Syracuse University in 2011. Professor Paakkunainen, I'll now turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have a little PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to share. Just one second. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit just very briefly about what CRISPR-Cas9 is. And then most of the presentation that I'll be doing is focused on some of the ethical issues around CRISPR-Cas9. There's a lot about the ethics that we could discuss, but I'll just be raising some questions for discussion. So CRISPR-Cas9, as many of you probably know, is a method of gene editing. So basically you can remove or add or alter sections of a DNA sequence using this method. So Cas9 is an enzyme that breaks up the DNA sequence at a particular location. The enzyme is guided to that location using something called guide RNA, gRNA, and then there's a way for the DNA sequence to be repaired at that location. So you can learn more about how the biology of that works. In a lot of places, I've provided one link there. But one thing to know about this is that it's currently the fastest, cheapest, and most accurate way of editing genes. There are some other methods that have been developed, but this has become the best so far. And so even though the actual method of editing a location in a particular sequence of DNA has become fairly cheap, that doesn't mean that gene therapies using this method are themselves overall cheap. And that's a point that is going to become relevant later. And so this is a fairly recent method. Emmanuel Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna received the 2020 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for discovering and developing this method based on research that they started in 2011, 2012. So you can find out more about that through the link that I've provided there as well. So let me first talk a little bit about the ethical promise of CRISPR-Cas9 technology. So obviously there's reasons why people are very excited about this. And the most obvious reason is that it promises a way to eliminate or cure diseases. So some, diseases have a genetic component, they're heritable. And so if you could edit the genes that cause that disease, perhaps you could thereby eliminate it. Also, there's perhaps ways in which you could edit, for example, create genetically modified T cells that are involved in immune response, and in that way enable our immune system to attack certain diseases better. One of the most recent kind of exciting developments here is a CRISPR-based COVID-19 test that's being developed. So there's a lot of different kind of medical exciting interventions that are possible. And another kind of application of the technology would be to make new and better GMOs, genetically modified organisms, for agriculture. For example, making crops more nutritious or making them more pest resilient. And so the overall idea here is that, insofar as these applications look ethically promising, it's because they promise to increase human well-being. So if it's ethically desirable to increase human well-being, then it's ethically desirable to pursue these applications of CRISPR-Cas9 technology, provided that they don't have any major ethical downsides that then outweigh the benefits. So what about some of the downsides then? What about some of the challenges? So that's what we're going to be focusing on. There's a lot of different things you might think of under this heading. One is sort of bioweapons. Another is unintended bad effects of GMOs on the environment. So maybe you don't quite know what the overall effect on a particular, on the interactions between various organisms will be if you modify one organism in the environment, or there might be off-target effects for that organism itself. There might be likewise unintended off-target bad effects of gene therapies on humans, and we haven't totally figured it out yet. But our focus is going to be on the issue of designer babies in particular. And so here too, you might worry about unintended or off-target effects, but we want to focus more squarely on kind of more principled concerns that you might have about the technology or using the technology to design babies. So even if we could be certain that we're targeting the genes that we want to be targeting, and we're not creating some other off-target long-term issue for the edited baby, you might still think there are nonetheless ethical concerns about doing that. So that's the focus that sort of I want to raise here, because these issues might be somewhat less obvious than the worry about off-target effects. So one worry that people sometimes raise has to do with autonomy. And by autonomy, I just mean self-determination or self-governance. So your kind of right or entitlement to determine the shape of your life or how your life will go for you, to the extent that we have such a right. So the worry here is that genetic enhancement of unborn children would violate those children's right to autonomy by denying the child's right to an open future. So if we're determining certain genetic predispositions or characteristics of the child, we're determining how their future will be in certain respects. So this is a worry that the philosopher Michael Sandel discusses in an article and then later a book called The Case Against Perfection. He doesn't ultimately find the worry convincing though, and his response basically is that, well, children don't get to choose their own characteristics anyway. They are no more nor less autonomous under intentional enhancement than under the usual genetic lottery, right? So you don't get to choose how your genes are under normal circumstances anyway. So I wonder how good of a response you guys think that is. So that will be something we can discuss in Q&A. Another kind of worry that's often raised concerns unfair advantage. So the idea here is just that the enhanced would have an unfair advantage in sports, business, education, and so on over the unenhanced. And so this might be more of a concern that you might raise about particular kinds of enhancements rather than others. So sometimes people raise the specter of, enhancing people's physical capabilities in a certain way, enhancing certain dimension of athletic prowess, or enhancing the genes that are, involved in certain kind of cognitive capacities such as memory or attention. And so you could see how those might lead to competitive advantages. One question here, though, is why should we consider such advantages unfair? So we don't consider natural differences in ability unfair. So why would artificially induced differences in ability be unfair? So a very tempting answer here is that the unfairness would come from an unequal access, and in particular access only to the rich, to these enhancements. And so, as I said, CRISPR-Cas9 technology itself has become fairly inexpensive, but the gene therapies that are being developed from those, that doesn't mean that those are inexpensive. So there's just a kind of example that I've linked to here about a therapy that has been developed, and I think the first approved gene therapy in the US, and I think about to be approved in the UK as well, for degenerative eye condition that basically causes severe visual impairment. And the current cost of that is estimated over $400,000. So this is not currently anyway cheap. And so you can see how, if the rich could only, if only the rich had access to various enhancements, that might look unfair and might look like something that will just deepen existing inequalities already. And an additional layer of concern here is that, if you start editing the human germline in particular, so reproductive cells, or if you edit embryos, in which case you'll be editing things that will be passed on, you'll pass on the enhancements to the offspring of the edited person, and that would, lead to inherited advantages and disadvantages based on who has access to these treatments, and you might worry that this would create two or more very unequal classes of persons, or deepen existing inequalities even more. A further kind of concern is about discrimination and eugenics. So eugenics just means, good origins or good genes, but there's a history of eugenics where, we have used forced sterilizations on certain populations, or genocide because of perceived defects or perceived undesirable characteristics. And so genetic enhancement technologies, and in particular CRISPR gene editing, could be used as just another instrument for discrimination, for example, on the basis of disability or skin color. So eliminating kinds of traits, and thereby eliminating, kinds of populations from being. Now, of course, this doesn't mean killing existing people who have a particular disability, or killing existing people who have a particular skin color, but it would mean shaping future populations into an image of perfection where we don't want certain disabilities around, or we don't want certain skin colors around. And so that's a kind of danger that there's some good reason to be cautious about, just because of historical precedent. And so one kind of response you might worry about here, or that you might raise here, is that, well, maybe we can just limit CRISPR gene editing and genetic enhancement of babies in particular to the medical, and so, so-called non-medical enhancements, things that there's no real medical reason for, such as, for example, modifying someone's skin color, maybe should be outlawed, and that would just do away with that worry. But one concern here is that it's not so obvious how to draw the line between the medical versus non-medical, and it may be partly a value question exactly where we draw it. So, for example, many disabilities are classified in our culture as medical problems or defects to be cured, but there's a real question about whether all disabilities should be conceived of, or even any disability should be conceived of as defects to be medically cured or prevented, or whether they're just ways of being differently abled. And the problem, if any, that having a disability causes for you in your life is more actually due to the way that the environment treats you because of your condition, rather than because of inherent because of this disability being an inherent defect. One way in which you might try to make progress here is to think about, well, maybe we should just try to eliminate the conditions that obviously negatively impact human well-being. So there are certain conditions that seem like they should probably pretty obviously do that. So something that causes severe pain, so something like Tay-Sachs or beta thalassemia, which often does cause severe pain, maybe those negatively do impact human well-being. And so maybe that's a good reason to classify them as, candidates for medical intervention. But yeah, it's again not obvious whether all disabilities negatively impact human well-being. One of the philosophical questions here is, what does well-being consist in anyway? So if well-being just consists in life satisfaction, or let's say your desires being satisfied, which are some of the theories of well-being that people have, that philosophers have in particular, then you might think that, well, we should look to what certain disabled communities themselves say, or certain disabled people themselves say about how satisfied they are with their lives, or how satisfied they are with certain aspects of their lives. And that should determine whether disability does negatively impact your well-being or not. And lastly, a kind of philosophical question here is that, even if a condition, let's say autism or severe visual impairment, which have kind of genetic components, so even if those conditions negatively impact human well-being, does that make it permissible to eliminate future people who have that condition from the population? And you might think that you can't infer from the negative impact on well-being to the permissibility of eliminating those kind of populations. And one kind of worry here is that it sends a kind of message to people with those conditions that their lives aren't as valuable as other kinds of lives, that they should perhaps never have existed. We should aim at the world in which people like them do not exist. And it also may end up in people deprioritizing, sort of making environments more hospitable to people with certain disabilities rather than, trying to, quote unquote, cure those people. Okay, so one last worry that I'll just mention is perhaps a little more nebulous one, but it's just the worry of, what's the world coming to? This is all kind of scary, the way that technology is moving, and ethically sometimes it's hard to keep up. But one kind of way in which you might phrase this worry is that there's a kind of ideal of a world that we would be falling short of if we were continually striving to enhance and master our natures. So a world in which people are continually striving to enhance and master their natures is worse than a world in which people show openness to the unbidden and grace and resilience in the face of it. So this is what Michael Sandel, the philosopher I mentioned before, actually thinks is ultimately the big concern here, and he sometimes puts it in terms of virtue. He thinks openness to the unbidden is a kind of virtue that would be undermined in a world in which we continually try to master our natures, control them. But so a question here is just, what kind of a world do you want to live in? So those are some questions for consideration. I've put some sources and resources here, and let me hand it over to Professor Gorovitz now.
Okay. Liz, am I on and audible?
You are.
All right, good, thank you. Well, I'm going to be quite quick here because what I'm most interested in is interacting with the participants and responding to their questions and comments. I'll say a few things quite quickly that are linked to the presentation from my colleague Hille, by pointing out first that these issues, which are relatively new in their specific reference to COVID, rather to CRISPR and Cas9 technology, raise issues that have been with us in some ways for millennia. Questions of what values are most important, what kind of world do we want to live in, what kind of people do we aspire to be, and do we most respect in others. But there is something new in that this technology gives us capacities that have a kind of accessibility that didn't exist before. The distinctive characteristic of the Cas9 CRISPR technology is that it's really easy to access and use in some ways. My grandson used it as an undergraduate a year and a half ago at the University of Chicago. Right now, as mentioned in Elizabeth Colbert's New Yorker article that appeared only 2 days ago, one can order by mail online a kit for about $200 that will enable you to do gene editing at home in your kitchen or garage. Not gene therapy, but actually using some of these techniques. So in one sense, there's no stopping it. It's out there, it is available, its applications are diverse, but we are only just beginning to understand what the full range of those applications might be. So what do philosophers have to say about this? What role can we play? What role can we be expected to play? Well, first, one of the characteristic roles that philosophers play is to try to elevate the quality of discussion. And the quality of discussion in matters like this is chronically very poor. If you want to see paradigms of poor discussion, just listen to the political speeches that are around these days, or pay attention to the content of advertising. we hear over and over again reference to what is classically called the slippery slope argument. If we allow this first step or this second step, then unavoidably that will lead to a terrible outcome. Therefore, we dare not take the first step. Now, slippery slope arguments, which are pervasive, they're all around. They include things like, if we don't draw the line in Vietnam, then next Tuesday there'll be invasions in California. Some slippery slope arguments are really good, and some are very bad. And so one thing that's important is to understand what is the difference between a good and a bad slippery slope argument. When should we take such an argument seriously? When should we say, no, that's a flawed argument? Philosophical scrutiny is very good at that kind of thing. Another distinction that's really important is the distinction between matters of fact and matters of value. And Hille referred to this. It's important to try to establish the best possible evidential grounding for our factual claims. And that means paying attention to the epistemology. What do we think we know? Why do we think we know it? How good is the evidence? What are the weaknesses of the evidence? And to distinguish that between values, which are affirmations of personal preference about good and bad. And a very common phenomenon in political or moral debate is claiming that something is a matter of fact when it isn't, when it's an affirmation of value. A third role that philosophers typically play, and I think quite effectively, is to bring rigorous scrutiny to claims about what follows from what. So often we'll hear arguments that have the form, well, there's A, proposition A, which is true, and proposition B, which is true, therefore C follows. But it often does not follow. And so one has to ask, why do you think your conclusion follows from the premises? I'm willing to grant the premises, but not the inference. So in those ways, a classic philosophical role is elevating the integrity and quality of thought and discussion that goes into public debate about matters of policy. There's another role, of course, that philosophers can and should play, and that is to argue as vigorously as possible for the values that we each are willing to endorse, not pretending that they're matters of fact when they are matters of value, but acknowledging that they are matters of value and trying to offer the best defense of them that we can. So there's been a lot of talk recently about the Constitution, which has been read carefully by naturalized citizens and about which most American citizens seem to be stunningly ignorant. And when I ask a classroom full of students questions about the Constitution, if they're immigrants, they know what's in there. If they're naturalized citizens, they know what's in there. If they're Americans who were born here, apart from Native Americans, their ignorance is dazzling, right? So it was the case at one point historically that though allegedly all humans were created or should be thought of as equal, only some were viewed as equal, some were disenfranchised, some were classified as 3/5, 60% of a human being. Well, that's an indefensible moral position. So an appropriate philosophical role also is to take on bad morality and to say, no, it is not acceptable ever to enslave another person. It is not acceptable ever to diminish the full humanity of another person. Those are moral claims, and we're prepared to argue in their defense. And in doing so, we are taking a substantive stand about matters of morality. Now, at the moment, at the international level, nobody knows what the answers should be about CRISPR-Cas9 technology. The questions are flowing forth, emerging almost week by week as new uses are developed and new anxieties are formulated. And so there is discussion internationally about not just what to do, but how best to think about what to do. Who should be involved in the decisional processes? And Hille mentioned this as well. If you want to talk about the values that are embraced by people whom we think of as having a disability, we should not be talking about them without listening to them, without empowering them to be participants in decision making. Well, when we're looking at a technology that can be used in ways that might affect massive populations throughout the world, how do we properly structure the decisional dialogues? Now, what I want to emphasize is everybody gets to play. What we hope to do today is stimulate some thinking, give you perhaps some tools that you can use in thinking, and say, if you care about this, get in on it, because you are as entitled to be a participant in the decisional debates as anybody else. So I think I'll stop there and ask that there be some interaction.
Okay, thank you, Sam. So what we're going to do right now is allow you to ask questions. You can do it one of two ways. You can submit your question through the chat box, and as you can see, a few people are starting to populate that. Also, if you want to speak, please press the raise hand icon, and I will, at the appropriate time, call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. Just ask that you keep your question concise, and so that everybody has an opportunity to speak. So I'm going to go first to Tony's question, and it's about insurance companies and could insurance companies force us to use this technology to reduce future medical costs? And Sam and Hille, I'll let you decide who wants to take that.
Well,
yeah.
Sam, go ahead.
Maybe we should each offer a brief reaction. When something is made possible, then pressures exist to make it either necessary or to make it at least implicitly coercive. So we have to be very careful about what the consequences are of saying something is available. An example that has nothing to do with CRISPR or Cas9 has to do with prenatal diagnosis. If you know prenatally that your child is going to have a particular handicap or a particular suboptimal characteristic, which is preventable, then if you do not exercise that option to prevent it, you may be subjected to certain kinds of negative consequences, not necessarily just from insurance, but from societal reactions. You might be subjected to disapproval, to community scorn, to a claim that your behavior is selfish. And these things can be really harmful. So making something possible can make it something less than a fully free option. Now, that's separate from insurance companies. Insurance companies might indeed at some point mandate certain kinds of interventions, absent which you would lose access to certain kinds of coverage. There's very little under the heading of bad behavior that insurance companies won't behave in. And the evidence for that is that there's very little bad behavior available to insurance companies historically that they have not already behaved in. Hille.
Hille, did you have something to add?
Well, no, I don't have much to add to what Sam said. I mean, it does seem like a danger that we should be alert to, and it's a good question for regulators to try to be alert to and see if if there could be regulation to prevent misuses like that. But yeah, I mean, there's, I suppose, some substantive questions to be asked also about, to what extent, should, let's say nationally funded health systems such as those in the UK, push use of something like this in order to maybe in the long term reduce overall medical costs, that could be viewed as a danger. Some people might view it as at least there's some benefit to that. But yeah, I don't have a lot to add beyond what Sam said.
Okay. Hille, I think this is a good question for you then. Michael asks, does anyone believe that there was virtue in having polio 100 years ago while struggling to ambulate with leg braces and crutches? If no, then why would we think of struggling with autism or hereditary blindness as being virtuous?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And, when you put it like that, is there a virtue in having to struggle with these? Maybe, your phrasing kind of suggests a negative answer. But so I should say, I guess, first of all, I certainly didn't mean to be presenting the last word on any of this, just kind of to raise some questions for discussion. But, the way that, if I understand the way Michael Sandel is thinking about this and his thoughts about virtue here, it's not that struggling with a particular condition is itself virtuous, but rather there's a virtue of being open to whatever happens to you, or at least within certain limitations, and of not trying to control everything in your life, not trying to master everything in your life. So that virtue might be exhibited in, for example, living with certain conditions. So it's not that there's somehow in itself virtuous, something in itself virtuous in living with these conditions. But yeah, I mean, I do think that that's a great point. And, maybe one thing that you might say in favor of Sandel's point of view here is that, or in favor of the kind of virtue that he's gesturing at, is that, there's maybe a kind of enlarged sympathies or empathies and openness to understanding other people's perspectives that come from, not trying to control and, quote unquote, cure all conditions. And I think, again, with some of the examples that you raised, you might have different views about say polio versus autism. So some autistic persons think of it as a way of being atypical, or not being neurotypical, and not as itself a struggle. It's just a way of being different. Whereas perhaps polio is more obviously something that you would really have to struggle with. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll add one comment here that Hille reminded me of, and that is there are many people today who remember that as children, being left-handed, they were viewed as anomalous and unacceptable, and there were efforts to retrain them to get over that disability. Now, that is just nuts. And yet they were subjected to a societal corrective intervention, something akin to what is now called conversion therapy, which is a homophobic assault on people. So we do have to be very cautious about societal judgments about normalization, when often the problem is in the perception of the person who is taxonomizing somebody else as not normal in some negative way as a result of deficiencies in that person's perception and understanding.
Okay, Jeff had a comment, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. He says, so often new technology gets out ahead of the culture and society. For example, CT scanning, when it was new in the 70s, was not clearly prescribed for what conditions at the start, and there were misuses that had to be reversed. Rather than as clearly as possible laying out the proper use of the technology at the outset, it was treated almost as a new toy. So is CRISPR a similar thing? Is this a new toy that people are using and we haven't really clearly laid out what is the proper use of it?
Well, I mean, I think there have already been some uses that people have raised big concerns about. So, there was back in 2018, a scientist in China who claimed to create the first designer babies that were, edited to not be susceptible to HIV. And, concerns that people raised about that were that this wasn't researched enough. They don't know whether there'll be off-target effects, bad long-term effects, but also, it wasn't clear what the, I guess, research ethics of the case was the research and the intervention itself kind of ethically employed. But so there's worries about that. But I think, there is actually a lot of, there is a lot of public discussion around this now, and these days, word news travel very fast, and there's a lot of attention to this. So, and people are cautious, and so germline editing is illegal in, as far as I know, all countries that have any legislation about this. Even though there's still genetic therapies that target sort of adult cells or somatic cells, germline editing that would pass on sort of, would make the changes heritable. That's people are worried about that and are cautious about that, I think, for good reason.
There's one disanalogy between the CAT scan as an emerging technology and CRISPR-Cas9. And that is the cost of CAT scan equipment. I mean, it is very few people who would think, oh, this is interesting. I'd like to see what I could do with it. I'll just order one and set it up in the garage or the basement. And these are just immensely expensive things, whereas at least some access to CRISPR-Cas9 technology is very inexpensive. Not the application, the therapeutic or clinical application, but the wherewithal to get started fiddling around with it. And because of that accessibility, the risk, I think, is much greater. We do need to figure out what it can do, what it should do, what it shouldn't do. And part of the problem is that even when there are clear legal limits or policy limits or best practice limits, there's the problem of compliance. And it's a lot easier to monitor the compliance of the way people use CAT scan equipment than to monitor the compliance of people who are doing things that can be done in a garage or any sophisticated university lab.
Okay. Albert had a comment and question. Our genetic heritage is the way it is for a reason. Short-term benefits might lead to many long-term harms. Shouldn't we apply the precautionary principle? Hille, I think you have spoken about this a couple times. Not sure if there's much more to say on it right now.
Yeah, I mean, so people are worried about long-term harms and, off-target effects. So, they're trying to make the CRISPR-Cas9 technology more precise even than it is currently. And, so people are trying to be cautious. But I guess, maybe the caution, you might think that it shouldn't go as far as to stop research on this completely. And, it's rather, don't apply it in ways that are too risky currently, or as far as we know. That would be, I guess, my take on that.
Yeah, I want to push back on the question a little bit because the claim our genetic heritage is as it is for a reason. I want to push pause right there and say, now, wait a minute. For a reason, what reason exactly? What is the alleged reason that our genetic heritage is as it is? And as I say this, I look at the various images and I see a lot of people wearing glasses. You know, that's an intervention. That's a step that we have taken to correct what we perceive as functional human beings as a deficiency. And it gives the lie to the notion that, you know, all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds, the Alexander Pope kind of notion. There's a lot about our genetic heritage that is not such a good thing. And of course, I endorse the notion of caution, but the reference to the cautionary principle also is underspecified because there isn't a single principle that we can identify with the phrase the cautionary principle. Rather, we need to be appropriately cautious. And part of our struggle is to figure out what constitutes appropriate levels of caution. And so if you read the brand new article by Betsy Colbert in the New Yorker about the use of Cas9, Crispr, there's a terrible problem in Australia, and there are risks to using this technique of genetic intervention, but the risks of not doing it in terms of human health and well-being and the economy are immense. So here's an emerging problem, which I will tell you a week ago I would never have envisioned, where precisely the problem is, how do we best think about what caution properly means in this new context? So the question I welcome because it points us in the direction of further important questions. But as first framed, the question requires unpacking and clarification. And that's, of course, just the kind of things that philosophers do, which is exactly why the citizens of Athens wanted to be rid of Socrates.
Okay, Marilyn says that we should definitely have a cautious, even no hands-on approach with regard to changing germplasm that would pass on to future generations. But the use of CRISPR to make somatic mutations, i.e. as being used for sickle cell disease now, is a good use of CRISPR. Care to comment on that, Hille?
Sure, yeah, I could say something about that. So yeah, the sickle cell anemia cure that is being developed, it does look very promising. And as far as I understand, it's not yet approved, but it is showing really promising results. And so, that does look like a great potential application. And one thing that I'd want to note about that is that, I will be interested to see how expensive the treatment will be, because although again CRISPR-Cas9 technology itself is becoming cheap, actually doing the sickle cell therapy that you're talking about involves taking stem cells, hematopoietic stem cells, these blood-producing stem cells from the body of the person being treated, and then, taking those to a lab and doing a very specific, genetic modification on those. And in the meanwhile, the person, the other stem cell population of the person has to be controlled such that that's not the one that takes over and controls that, the blood cells keep being, the new blood cells that are being produced would keep being diseased ones. So there's an intervention that's needed for the patient in the meanwhile. And then, the stem cells that have been modified, they need to be kind of put back into the body, and they need to be the ones that take control, as it were. And so that it's a very involved process. And again, the cost of the treatment will be crucial. And, as you probably know, sickle cell anemia is disproportionately affects in America, African Americans, but more generally, people of African heritage. And so insofar as kind of socioeconomic realities are such that, these are often populations with not very many economic resources, it will be very important for that cost to come down. And I don't know what it will be at this point.
We had a question offline that I wanted to convey from Bob, and he's asking about SU in particular and university research in general. Are university researchers, and I would think in the STEM fields primarily, are they scrutinized in terms of the bioethics of the research they're doing? We know that the university has protocols around animal use in research. Are university researchers scrutinized for the potential ethical implications of the research they're doing?
Absolutely, yes. Every research project has to pass various tests. One has to do with just the basic safety of doing the research. So if you're doing certain kinds of research that just involve paper, doing surveys, for example, no one is going to be very concerned about the physical environment in which you're doing it, though there will be concern about whether the results might be used in a way that disadvantages or harms some particular population. So even at that very simple level, there's a level of scrutiny. If you're doing research on something that is highly contagious, you may need what's called a P4 containment environment, which is the highest level. That's what's going on when people do research on things like the smallpox virus and everything in between. So there's scrutiny of the doing of the research, but there's also a vetting of the potential consequences of the results of the research. That doesn't mean that it's a flawless system, but without question, there are various categories, and every researcher who wants approval of a research project has to show that it has been approved by the Human Subjects Research Committee, or that the Human Research Subjects Committee has affirmed that it need not have that approval. So I hope that's responsive to Bob's question.
Thank you. We have time for a few more questions. Marianne says that she just attended a conference of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and the central question there was, can democracy survive inequality? And as she says, as Hille usefully pointed out, CRISPR will increase economic inequality, or may increase economic inequality. And she says it's fundamentally a moral question and a political one, and wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Sam, do you want to start?
Well, sure. Yeah, I think inequality has been an inherent feature of democracies always and everywhere. Our democracy is right now threatened as never before because it is dealing with the impact of 400 years of severe inequality, inadequately addressed. So I don't think I would say democracy can't survive inequality. Rather, I would put it this way. What is essential to the survival of democracy is an ongoing, unremitting effort to reduce inequality. We will not achieve equality, but I think that what we must do is ever strive to reduce the inequality that threatens democracy. So we had only certain people, white landowners, white male landowners you could vote. If you look at the history of enfranchisement in this country, little by little, painfully, slowly, imperfectly, we have reduced the categories of inequality. And most of that work, I think, remains still to be done. And what COVID-19 has done as never before, intersecting with social media, is made absolutely vivid, unmistakably clear to everybody how pervasive and corrosive inequality is. And we have the opportunity now to accelerate our efforts to reduce inequality, and that can possibly save democracy. Working constantly against inequality. We can't eliminate it, but we can survive if we strive visibly and unremittingly to reduce it.
So could I add maybe, one kind of question here is, inequality of what, or equality of what are we striving towards?
Yeah.
And what kind of inequality or equality most matters for democratic participation? And so, you might think that, we're never going to have absolute equality of abilities, for example, and maybe that's not even something that we should be striving towards. But something that does seem valuable, and a lot of political philosophers find it an important value to kind of theorize around, is equality of opportunity. And so, oftentimes we don't think that the circumstances of our birth should have a big negative impact on the opportunities that we will have in our life. And, a concern, I guess, that Crispr might raise is that, a widening, a very wide gap between abilities might translate to a widening gap between people's opportunities. And, so opportunities for education, for certain kinds of careers, for example, do seem to affect, opportunities for democratic participation of various sorts. Will you have time to invest in exploring what the different viewpoints are? Will you be someone who has time to perhaps invest in a political career in order to, not just participate by voting, but participate by being one of the decision makers? And so, those, various of our life opportunities often translate into different questions about what the chances are of you participating in those various ways. And, if the inequalities become very, very large, I think there is a concern that certain populations will be disenfranchised from participating in those ways.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I think this is a good one. Barry posed it. So recognizing that the CRISPR genie is out of the bottle and it's here and it's very accessible, what can be done to regulate or control or mitigate the potential damages that you guys have spoken about? Who's overseeing this? Who's looking at it to make sure it doesn't run amok?
Well, I guess my response to that is to say, well, you who just asked that question, and all the rest of us, there is no overarching body at the international level. That's just what the discussion is focusing on. What should we do? Who's the we who should do it? And how do we best think about the gap between what we would envision as an ideal in respect to this technology and the reality that emerges? There was a time when rural electrification was a radical thought, the notion that some people were privileged because they had access to electricity, but people in rural environments didn't have electricity. And so governments took on the function of making electricity broadly available. There have been times when The fire department was something that you could have access to if you were a subscriber. You paid for the service. It was a kind of fee-for-service insurance. And if you weren't a subscriber, then your house could burn down. Nobody would do anything about it. We are constantly engaged with these societal decisions about who should have access to what, under what kinds of circumstances, at whose expense, and subject to what regulations. And this is part of the ongoing struggle of political philosophy and of democracy and of societal attempts to confront opportunities and challenges in a stable way. So it's ongoing work, and I would just encourage all of you to become active participants in the discussion, whether that means communicating a view to a legislator or writing an article or talking to friends, all available options.
Maybe can I just add a little bit in that? I mean, if you look at legislation around other kind of medical technologies, such as stem cell research, for example, it's really in the US, it's a patchwork, and I think that this is how it's going to be with CRISPR too. So there's very different state level laws regarding stem cell research, and very few federal laws regarding stem cell research. And I think that's probably the model that CRISPR legislation will go as well. So, insofar as you want to affect things in your state, that might be the best way for you to get involved in the conversation.
Great. Well, we're over our time, so I'm going to wrap things up now. I want to thank our professors for taking the time to put together these presentations and be here with us today. We really appreciate that. I want to thank all of you who came and attended this. We appreciate you participating. Keep an eye on your email for invitations to more events like this one. We'll be doing these throughout the spring semester, featuring faculty members talking about interesting things. We definitely did record the session, and it will be available on the College of Arts and Sciences YouTube page in the near future. So if you want to go back and look, please do that and refer anyone else to it. And with that, I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you again, and have a great evening.